I'm fine with it.
Okay.
Margaret, we can't see you yet either. I don't know if you can hear us even. Cheryl, good to see you. Oh, there you are, Margaret. Awesome. Are you okay with this being recorded, Margaret? Yep. Terry, you okay with this being recorded? Give me a thumbs up. Thank you.
And I muted everybody's microphone just so that we're not hearing feedback or background noise. When you do want to speak, just go ahead and unmute yourself and then mute yourself again. But we'll kind of keep everybody muted just for the sake of what happens typically in a large room, which we're all probably familiar with today. So yeah, Rob, why don't you start and pray?
I'd love to. Father, we welcome you as well. We know that you are everywhere and always present and with us, and your spirit lives in us, and we're inviting you, not just welcoming you, but inviting you to encourage us, to challenge us, to excite our thinking around these things, to bring clarity around how we are doing church and how we might do it even better. I pray that we would have open minds, open hearts, we would ask good questions, we would listen well, that you would give David a sense of where you're leading us, and that he would tap into that, and in the materials he's prepared, that they would help us see where you're leading us. Thanks for everyone who's joined here and taking the time. Just grateful for a church that cares about itself and the people that form it. And I pray that you would continue to bless Cedar Valley, because they are a blessing to each other, their community, and they certainly have been to me. In Jesus' name, I pray these things. Amen.
Amen. First thing we'd like to do is hear from all of you in a way that we can kind of gauge how everybody's feeling about this conversation. And so if you want to participate, you certainly don't have to, but if you want to participate on a separate screen or a different device, if you could go to menti.com and put that code in. And that question will come up on the screen for you. What we would love to do is hear what are some of the emotions that you're all feeling as you think about discussing your governance structure. As you're going to that website, this second, I guess, time together is going to be a little bit more presentation, a little bit more from me than you did on your last one. Last one was much more facilitating a process of talking through your church's vision, mission, values. Today is going to be a little bit more theory, a little bit more structure, content from me on board governance. So anxious, nervous, that's frustrated. Really good. That's good, helpful. So what are some emotions that you're feeling as you're discussing governance structure? Because we never do these things in a vacuum. They're always a context to how we're doing. Excited, concerned about getting it right. Cool. Frustrated and excited. Excited for change. Yeah. That's 7 people responding, 8. My opinions are my own. More trust. Yeah. Good. Really good. 9 people so far. If there's any more, I'll just give you another minute or two. Unsure where to start. Seems biased, excited to see the change happen, but worried about how it'll fit into today's context. Really great question. Really good comment. This is excellent to know from my perspective and for Rob's in guiding you beyond this. This is really good.
Excuse me?
Yep.
What was the website?
Menti, MENTI
Oh,
dot,
okay, that
.com.
MENTI.
TI.
Yeah,
Okay,
.com. 12 people so far.
Thanks for asking, Karen. That's
Yeah.
good. And did you get the code there, Karen? The 9084828? It's right at the top of that slide. It's very small though. Do you see it? Okay.
We'll just give Karen a minute if she wants to add to that, and then we'll move on to the next one. Looking forward to our unified outcome. Absolutely. Yeah, anytime we're talking about change that's significant, there's a lot of emotions tied to that, and a lot of questions tied to that about what's broken that we need to fix. If there's nothing broken, why are we fixing it? Sometimes not everyone's on the same page as to the brokenness of something. So uncertainty, yeah, all of this around change. That's really good. I'll ask you one more question. Thanks for letting everybody know where we're at. And given these range of emotions, it's really, really important that we respect where everybody's at emotionally in this conversation. Not everybody's coming to the conversation saying, yeah, let's go and change this whole thing. There's a lot of people who are feeling a little nervous and yeah, some tough emotions around it. So we want to be really careful of the emotional state of the people who are in the room as we're having these conversations. And I'm thankful that you were honest about that. I would love to hear also some words. If you this should have come up on your screen now. How would you describe your church's current governance structure? What are some words that would describe from your perspective? You don't have, there's no way to get it right or wrong here. We're not looking for any sort of academic answer. We're just from your perspective. What are some words, or how would you describe your church's current governance structure? If someone walked up at you on the street and said, hey, not that they ever would, but hey, tell me about your church's governance structure. How would you describe it? Good. All right. That's really good. So we're one pretty obvious thing about moving into today's conversation is there does seem from those that have responded a general sense that, okay, yeah, probably something broken here that we need to work on and change for the sake of the future. Yep, pretty clear. Okay. Thanks again for that. That's really good for us to know at facilitating the conversation, because I think this gives us both the need to be careful about the emotions of the people that are in the room, but also the freedom from the recognition that there needs to be some change in your governance structure. And so that allows us to move forward with some really great conversations here. We'll save these for you as well, so you can have reference to them after. And so what we want to do is move into more of a presentation after getting a little bit more of your input. And we want to talk about the differences between a working boards, multiple working boards in a church, or a working board versus a governing board. And we're going to draw that distinction pretty solidly this morning We're going to talk a lot about the difference between the two of them, because understanding what they are and what they should or shouldn't be is really important to determine where you're headed towards in terms of a new governance structure. One basic way of understanding the difference is that thinking in terms of acting as an individual on the board is the essential difference between being a working board or a governing board. So am I acting as an individual in this committee or this board or this team, or are we acting as a whole group at the same time? And we'll come to show more about what that looks like in a minute. But I would love to also hear what your thoughts are on a distinction between what are some of the things that would be in the job description of a working board, and what would be some of the things that would be in the job description of a governing board. And I'm going to write these down for us right now. So if you could unmute your microphone, or if you wanted to type it in the chat and maybe Rob could read it. If you could, mute your microphone and tell me what are some of the things that would be on the job description of a working board, or some of the things that would be on the job description of a governing. Why don't we start with working board? What are some things that would be distinct to a governing board? What would be the things that they would do?
Can I ask Dave, are people, it feels to me a little bit like I don't have enough information already to answer the question. Is anyone else feeling that way? And if so, just raise your hand and maybe Dave can walk us through it. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Thanks,
All
Justin. Right. So I would love to answer that question. From my perspective, I think I know what you're looking for because we've had this conversation, but if you could tell us a little bit more about the distinction so we could maybe answer the question better.
Okay, then what we're going to do is skip the screen altogether and go into exactly what the purpose for this is, to get people to sort things in their own mind if they're clear on the distinctions between two of them, because oftentimes you've got a group that's moving from being one to being another, and so those things on a job description are pretty clear. But in your case, I think, especially given that word cloud that we just saw earlier, there might not be enough context to even know the difference between the two of them, and we should just move on to talking about what the difference is.
I think that's probably accurate, guys. So with your permission, let's press on to the next slide.
So we'll give you some examples right off the bat. Working boards are just the general word to describe boards that are not functioning in a strict governance model. And so some of the characteristics of a working board would be, they would often be utilized in a startup. So a pastor or a director or a leader gets together a group of their friends because they know it needs to have a board, and not everybody's clear what it needs to be doing, but they just start boarding, or they start working on the organization. And so they're often utilized in a startup, but they don't transition from startup phase to the more mature phase of an organization. Individual board members doing the work of staff members. In other words, board members who are on some sort of a committee or a board who are involved in the day-to-day of the organization in ways that typically staff would be. They're typically designed more for small nonprofits that don't have a staff. However, if the organization is a legal entity, they have all of the same responsibilities as a governing board. So in a sense, you can't choose to have a governing board and a working board. If you're a legal organization and you're accountable to the government and the CRA, then you have to do all of the aspects of governing. And if there's no staff, the board member then also functions as a working board or the de facto staff of an organization. An example of this would be the treasurer acting as the bookkeeper of the organization. It often happens as your board responsibility and your working or staff responsibility gets kind of bled into just all of the same types of activities. Working boards are often acting as fundraisers, committees, admin volunteers, basically doing everything that needs to be done in an organization, because the board is also, the people who are all on the board are also those responsible for just the day-to-day working of the organization. And a focus on means as opposed to ends. Rob, do you have anything else to describe to that, or?
Well, two good questions here in the chat. Right. Dave, will your slideshow be available to us later? I'm assuming it will be. Okay. But I love that first question. Could we give the closest equivalence to our board? So when you're talking about working versus governing, how would those compare to what we opened with, being the reality of Cedar Valley? So elders, executive, finance. I think I know the answer, but I'd like to hear it from you.
Well, actually, I'd like for the people to hear it from you, because you know the theory that we've talked about, and between you and I, you know.
I don't want them to hear from me. I want them to hear from the expert. But
all right.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Well, interesting. And again, because of that word cloud, I can be pretty direct as to your governing situation. Is I asked Rob when we first started having these conversations, who's on the board, and I said, like, whose names are on the piece of paper in your charity return that goes to the government? Who's on that piece of paper as the board? And Rob said, I have no idea. Like, we have no idea I have no idea who the board is. You've got these 3 governing committees that are made up of some staff and some non-staff members. But when I said there was just no frame of reference for what the board was in your church. So I think what you've got, Rob, to be honest, is you've got 3 working boards all trying to govern the church.
That's how I would have answered it. And maybe there is an answer to that question that you asked me, Dave, that someone else in the group might have that I'm just not aware of. Would there be, guys? If you want to unmute yourselves for that answer. But that's how I would describe it, Dave. We have 3 teams of people that are working boards.
Trying
I would
to
say that too.
Or right. Trying to be. Yeah, okay.
Which that
I agree with Terry's comment.
Yeah, somewhere staff fit into that too.
Sorry, I missed that. Who said that? I agree with someone, Dave's comment.
Oh, I was saying that I agree with Terry's comment because it's more like 4 with the staff being a consideration, right? Like there are often initiatives from the staff that then they really do kind of function as a working board of themselves, even though they are staff, which counts. Yeah.
Yeah, that's Katie. Thanks, Kate. I was trying to find you. Yeah, thanks, Terry. I think you're probably right, guys. I think it's more like 4.
Which is so clearly why when I asked you to talk about what a working board and a governing board is, so difficult for you to do, because you don't have a working board, you have 4 working boards all trying to govern. And so anyway, that's, Rob, that's how I'd answer that question, and looks like everybody sort of would agree to that. Let me move on to showing some of the things that would be on the job description of a governing board. Typically, they are used for more maturing organizations as your governing structure matures with the organization, and as you've developed groups of people working on different parts of the organization, from volunteers to staff to a real governing board and anybody else that's there. The governing board's responsibility is what's called fiduciary responsibility, which is essentially you have the legal trust of the organization. These are the people who are held accountable for who the organization exists to benefit, which is what we talked about in the vision, mission, values section. It's the people with legal trust. This is important. And when I said to Rob, whose names are on the piece of paper with the government, and he couldn't answer, the question from a concern around that would be, that's the group of people that if there was ever a legal issue with the organization, they would be the people held accountable for like liable for damages or for whatever harm the organization were to do. Those are the people whose names are responsible for the legal trust of the organization.
Well, it's no wonder no one knows who they are. No one wants to be those people.
Yeah.
Now, when you say that, that sounds way more dire than it actually is. We have insurances for those things, etc. Right?
Sure.
To not alarm anybody.
No, but if my name was potentially on that piece of paper, I'd want to know that there was insurance and what the insurance would be. So it's not just an ethereal concept of responsibility. It's pretty real, and it becomes more real if there's ever a problem with the organization. Governing board members.
Great question, David. Can I ask that? Who is legally responsible right now? That's the question you're asking. Who's on that paper?
Well, I don't think it's important for right now, but sure, if you want
Okay.
to ask that for the sake of making it clear, go ahead.
I don't know.
Okay. Does any? Yeah.
When Brianna and I were working in the office, that was the executive chair.
Which I think it still is, who has resigned, and it now becomes Michelle's role as but there's got to be more than one name on that, I would think. So does that help answer that question? And does that bring some clarity to what we're thinking?
Well, it's not critical for today, other than
Okay.
that's the people who are responsible for governing would be the names on that piece of paper. You're heading in a direction of making that clear. So it's not really important to know who that is today, but
Okay.
but to give you your equivalent, that's your equivalent of your governing board. That's who should be governing, and that's who's held accountable for governing.
Like it. Thanks, buddy.
Yeah. They can still obviously participate as volunteers in the organization, as individuals, as Sunday school teachers or worship team members, but when they're on the board, they have a strict governing responsibility. The focus of a governing board is typically on the ends of the organization as opposed to the means. So governing boards focus on end statements, and we'll talk more about what that means next. And the staff or the people working for the organization focus on the ends or the means of how we're going to go about the day-to-day of operating, moving towards our vision. So that's an oversimplified concept of the difference between a working board and a governing board, but we're going to flesh that out here. But first of all, we're going to talk about dangers of not knowing the difference. So there's many, but a few that I've found most typical in organizations, and probably more specific to churches than other nonprofits, is individual board members all trying to figure out how to direct operational activity of the organization. If you don't understand the difference between ends and means, and you're just in there with your hands on the day-to-day of the organization, then everybody's trying to kind of influence the organization from their individual, I guess, leadership or influence of the organization. And in your case, you've got 4 working boards with all the individuals on those boards trying to direct operational activity of the church. And of course they would if they didn't understand that that's not their job. And so, but it does, the more working boards you have trying to govern, the more complex that it gets. Definitely confusing staff activities with board activities. That's also the case of a nonprofit when you've got board and staff on the same committee or board, not understanding the difference between ends and means. And oftentimes, if there's 8 people on a working board, in your sense, 3 or 4 of them, the lead pastor often feels like they've got 8 different bosses, rather than having one boss being the board. The pastoral staff are always trying to figure out who they should be listening to, because everybody on the working board, or the board, if it's working, is leading or influencing in a way where they're the individual leaders. Lead pastors frustrated with board members for the same reason, but also mismanaged expectations of board members. Burned out board members is a typical response, because if I don't understand the difference between working and governing, and I'm working all the time, then they're often pulled into way more than they need to be than they would be if they were a strict governing board. And so board members, this is the meetings that go way beyond the length of time that they should be going on. This is agendas without a clear filter of what should be on those agendas. And it just kind of becomes this mishmash of church activity, and leads to burned out board members that feel like they've got to be at everything in the church because they're a board member. And that's not an accurate description of what the job of a board member should be. And various expectations for what it means to be a board member is obviously a danger of not knowing the difference as well. Are there any others that you could add to this, dangers of not knowing the difference between a working board or a governing board?
Communication frustrations.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think distrust between board members and teams, or not necessarily even distrust, but maybe distrust, maybe the assignment of bad motivation. So they do this because, they do that because, and
Yeah.
there's little benefit of the doubt sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, sort of who's making the call here, and an us and them that develops, because you're not in the room when they're having discussions. They're not in the room when you're having discussions. So then people make up assumptions of what is behind certain decisions or non-decisions, and the intention, the motivations get made up.
And that's why it was so good, folks, for us to have had that meeting on last Thursday with all the, or Monday, with all the teams in, to start eliminating the guesswork and the assumptions.
Yeah, we don't need to park on this for very long, but obviously you're experiencing some of the dangers of not knowing the difference. We're gonna look at 4 governance models here, and the reason being is because what was important for Rob in this conversation was not assume that you wanted to move in the direction of one, but to first of all start with an understanding of different governance models, and so that you have an idea of, okay, if we need to make a change, what is it that we need to make a change to? And so we're not going to go over all 4 of these in exhaustive detail because it's kind of beyond the scope of a 2-hour meeting. But just to give you a broad sense, there's 4 main types of governance models that organizations use. One is sort of the constituent representative board. The characteristics of this kind of a board are the members are specifically selected to represent a constituency within the organization or a part of the organization. It's typically for large organizations or organizations that are made up of memberships of other organizations. And they're typically larger boards of anywhere between 15 to 40 people. And again, they're elected by their part of the organization to represent them. This is really what we have for our civil governance. This is how we govern ourselves in our political systems. Lots of written documentation, extremely important for consistency, given how many organizations and interests there are usually represented in a representative board. And they can be used for small to large organizations, but they're typically used for large ones. We won't talk about the positives and negatives of that because it doesn't really apply to your organization, other than the fact that you have a congregational governance factor, which seems a little bit like constituent representative model, but isn't. So I want to kind of give an initial nod to that's going to factor in. Working boards, talked about that a little bit already. Board members and staff working together on planning and actually doing the operational activities. Board members working as staff. These are typically board members who have a significant amount of time. They're again, typically small organizations where there is no staff, board, division, and people. So the people who are on the board also run the fundraiser, and they also decorate for the fundraiser, and they also do the books and run the programs. They're often organizations with strong committee structures because they realize that we need more than just these people who are on the board, and we pull other people in to serve on subcommittees, which essentially become staff subcommittees, but led by board members. Positives of this is there's strong buy-in. There are positives to this model because there's all hands-on deck culture to the organization. Everybody knows what's happening. Board is then typically connected to key issues day to day in the organization. The negatives is it becomes a heavy workload, especially for churches who have weekly activities, and it is difficult to recruit board members when there's not a clear understanding of what I'm doing when I'm a board member and what I'm doing when I'm a volunteer, and if those two things are different. The governing board or policy, the other term that's used often these days is the Carver model for board governance, is a clear distinction between staff and board roles. Board focus on ends, staff focus on means. The board's focus is to facilitate the process of vision, mission, values, and strategy, and not to execute the strategy, but to facilitate a process of making sure that one is created. They lead through policy and executive limitations. So no day-to-day responsibility for operations, we'll talk more about what executive limitations are later. Operational involvement as volunteer or on ad hoc subcommittees. So they still serve as volunteers. They still teach Sunday school and get involved in the worship team, but they realize that they're wearing one hat in one service and a different hat in another service, and and the two shall not meet and be on the same head at the same time. Often for medium to large organizations, positives is a centralized vision, clarity on roles and responsibilities, focus on the outcomes and results, limited operational involvement, empowers the lead pastor and the staff to be able to lead the day-to-day of the ministry. Board takes the role in ensuring adequate resources to make sure there's enough fuel in the tank to make the thing go. And there's much fewer board meetings in a governance model than there often is in organizations. Because if you're not working on the day-to-day and you're just focused on the ends, there's just less for this group of people to be taking up their time with in a healthy way. Negatives is the board staff can have the disconnection or divide between them. And so that needs to be looked at. Boards can feel disconnected from the programs. If you're not involved in the day-to-day as a governing board, board members might feel like they're kind of disconnected from the real reason the organization exists. There can be an us and them between staff and board if the executive doesn't look after making sure that doesn't happen. And in this model, the lead pastor or a CEO can overact or misuse the freedom that they have as the primary staff member of the board. So lots of trust is needed in the governance model. An advisory board, we won't talk much about this other than this is more of an ad hoc group. It's a group of volunteers to give advice or recommendations to the governing team. Doesn't have formal legal responsibilities, doesn't have decision-making responsibilities. People with specific expertise might be there to complement the leadership team, should be kept relatively small. I've seen churches use this where there's the senior pastor of a church or the lead pastor, and the lead pastor has some internal and external people that might come around him or her to kind of just advise, pray for them, be a support to them, but they don't have legal responsibility for decision-making of the organization. And that's how they can be used in a healthy way. You can read the positives and negatives later. Helpful to come up with some of those categories initially. Any questions that you've got before we move on to the specifics of governing? It's either clear or you're extremely bored and disconnected.
I would be curious to know, guys, where you think, and it'll sort of give us a sense of what we've understood so far. What model do you think would best represent Cedar Valley? So maybe, David, you have the slides at your disposal there. Give us a recap. There's working board, policy, advisory, and collective.
Question.
Right now, Terry, to answer your question.
Yeah. Okay.
Did you not find yourselves trying to slot our structure into that? Yeah, so I see Teresa nodding there. So Teresa, did you have a thought? I don't like putting people on the spot like that, Teresa, especially people who don't like to be put on the spot, which is probably someone like you. So did you have a thought?
Not quite. I was taking some notes on the whole thing altogether. So thank you, Dave, for the slides. And yeah, like I like Terry's question. He's asking now or in the future. And I think now, for example, if I'm on a finance committee board, I did see ourselves, and we had identified ourselves as the advisory. And then Dave said, this particular model, the people in this model would have no legal responsibility. That then I'm thinking, okay, but financially, if there were legal issues financially, then where do we fit in there? And maybe that's when we start going into the governance board, I think. And it has gone beyond advisory, but maybe my team members can clarify that or correct me there, but that's where I'm seeing it. And I definitely see pastors in the governance board, and I'm not sure where the elders fit, but the executive in a working board. That's my 2 cents.
Great question there. And elders, different churches have different elders, deacons, boards, and so that factors into it as well. A lot of churches do use the word elder for a ecclesiastical equivalent to a board, so a church equivalent to a board. And so, but again, that's not your situation, but that's often the case. Combo of working and governance, Pam. A mix of these, I can see the intention being governing, but there's a lot of working board, yeah, actions, decisions, tough. Yep. Everybody defaults to advisory.
I think
Yeah.
I think one of the clear distinctions that I find between governing and working is that a governing board requires a lot of staffing. It seems to require a ton of staffing resources, which we don't have access to. So a large organization can easily have, someone on staff who's in charge of, has a much more executive role, a teaching role, an administration role, a policy role. Like that's big church language, which basically makes me think it eliminates that option for us.
Thanks for that comment, and that's a good observation. And there is a way of in a small church or a medium to small size church, having a board that does function in a strict governance model, but then also utilizes those people as individuals to serve in various aspects of making the thing run day to day. But it's just key to know the difference of when that's happening and when that's not. But that's a really good observation, Justin, because if you don't understand working as a board, working as a group versus when you're working as an individual, it could seem like this is only for large organizations, but it doesn't need to be. Let's move on.
I get the sense that it's like that people are quite confused in terms of like, they don't really know where they fit. And sometimes people change like what model they think they're in. And to me, that just seems like if the people on the boards don't totally know what their roles are, that can just be a confusing place to be.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Leslie.
Even our bylaws makes these a bit convoluted too. Like it overlaps a couple of these designs, so there's a bit of confusion there, which we don't necessarily operate within our bylaws either way. So
I would say the last time we read through our bylaws, I was a bit surprised to see. I think it actually reads very working board model because strictly according to the bylaws, you really don't need staff in any form. Between the elders, executive, and finance, they take care of every role needed, and staff make it kind of happen.
Can I ask a question around that? Are you talking about your society bylaws, the ones that the government holds you accountable to that you need to have in place? Or are you talking about your governance manual or how you go about the understanding of how your group functions internal to the organization? So is this the government document on how you're supposed to function, or is this just what you use to govern yourselves internally?
They're a bit one and the same right now.
Okay.
What? Okay. What do you mean by that, Grant?
In response to Dave's question?
Yeah.
I don't know that. Like, I think we have some MCBC level documents that would be very specific to the government requirements of Societies Act. But right now, as far as I can tell, we only kind of have one document that would fill both of those that's on our premise that we know about with that little blue book.
I think for this conversation, it's probably more the latter though, Dave. It's internal governance, how we operate, how we understand each other.
Okay. Yeah. And
what's been referred to so far anyway.
Right. And that's much easier to change than your society bylaws that we're held accountable to from the government. So in one sense, if you're referring to what's your governance manual, you can determine how to change that internal to the organization, and you would be able to make the changes necessary to live within a healthier, clearer structure without having to worry about your society's act bylaws.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, guys, I think that is taken care of by MCBC Grant, the society's connection, and we're represented that way, and that's where our legal insurances are represented as well.
Great. Let's keep going. So in terms of different models of board organization, you've got advisory boards that can be under-involved, working boards who are over-involved and can end up micromanaging the organization, which we've already talked about being the case. But often, and this is sort of what Justin was referring to earlier with his comment, is most medium to small nonprofits where we live our lives as a organization that helps them, is there's often a hybrid used, between a working board and a governing board. And this is how we would describe that hybrid. So the board as a group functions in a strict governance policy a premise with a very limited scope of activities and meetings. But individual board members may serve a chair or serve on a subcommittee or recruit other committee members among the people who the organization exists to benefit, whether those are the people who attend the church or whether those are people outside of the church, depending on the ministries of the church. But just this really clear understanding that when I'm in a board meeting, I'm wearing a board hat, and this is what that means. And then when I'm leaving the boardroom, going into just doing the ministry of the church, I'm wearing a completely different hat than I am when I'm in a board meeting. And that's how the hybrid typically works to allow medium to smaller organizations have board members that also get involved in the day-to-day, as would staff. They become essentially volunteer staff members or volunteers, which allows board members with less available time still able to serve on the board without it becoming this big monster of a whole bunch of activity, because they clearly understand, in this role I'm governing, in this role I'm working or serving as a volunteer. So they're governing as a board, but you're also working as individuals. And we'll talk more about what that looks like. But to Grant's point and question, there is a way that medium to small nonprofits can still function in this way. What's the problem with the way things are? You've talked about them all already. Over involvement of the board to micromanage the organization, or under involvement of the board where there can be disengagement in what the real governing activities are. And I don't know that I've ever met a lead pastor or an executive director that is trying to get their board either less involved in the day-to-day or more involved in the day-to-day. They're just, every single one of them is trying to involve their board more or less. And this structure gives you the ability to find that balance and actually it not be a balance, but have it be really clear. Consequences of an we've talked about this already. What are the consequences of an under-involved board? You've given many of your answers to that. But I would love to hear more about your situation in answer to this third question. What are the consequences of various leadership committees not understanding their role in governance? What's your experience? And how does your experience lead you to answer that question? Yeah.
I think there's a lot to be said for, like, if you don't fully understand your role, it's easy to overstep or understep. Similar to what Grant was saying, where like sometimes the boards are working in governance and then sometimes they're all advisory because they don't actually want like all the decision making or all the responsibility for it. So without knowing your real role and what you're responsible for, it's really easy to do more or do less when that might not actually be your role.
Exactly. Yeah, ×4.
Yes.
And I think one of the concerns that most pastors have, me for sure, would be that in that unclarity, there'll be burnout, because you'll be doing a lot of good things or trying to do a lot of good things or conceiving a lot of good things that just don't happen. And we all have discretionary time, right? We want to use it wisely. And if we feel like we're moving forward, but we're getting second guessed by or third or fourth guessed by, whether that's executive feeling that way or staff, or it's exhausting.
Totally.
I think what we've seen with some of our various leadership committees is that they have been working on the same things in their own meetings. And so they're kind of doubling up time. And so then when you come back, when you join them together, well, this one group has spent quite a bit of time working on that. And the other group has also spent quite a bit of time working on that from different perspectives. And then it could be a lot more efficient. And unfortunately, it isn't.
Thanks, Doug.
Yeah, and I think too, like what Rob was saying, just the burnout factor. When you're in a position where you talk about the same things over and over, but another branch of someone who also thinks it's their job to do the same thing or make those decisions is saying no or yes, against the work that you think you're trying to do, it just promotes a lot of frustration. And when you pour so much effort into events that become unfruitful or seem like they don't go anywhere, then burnout happens and people wonder why they're doing it.
Yeah, and people have a very limited amount of discretionary time, and you go to a meeting to find out some other committee's been talking about the same thing that you've been, and you're kind of like, why were we just here for the last 2 hours?
Yeah, and it might explain why it's hard to attract people to lead roles.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Okay, that's great. We're clear. Before we get into what the job of a governing board specifically is, boards are often made up of people who are leaders in their own areas in life, and then they try to lead the board from the perspective of their outside organization influence. If they're a lawyer or a bank keeper, or if they're a children's an educator and they work in schools, then they kind of bring that mindset into the board, trying to have that kind of an influence on the organization. And that's what Rob was speaking to regarding having so many different perspectives that the senior pastor or lead pastor needs to take into consideration, because when they get a phone call from that person, they can't not hear them as one of the bosses that they're responsible to. When a board doesn't know its role, what it is and isn't, it spends most of its time discussing operational issues. If it doesn't know what the ends issues are, it focuses almost entirely on means issues or operational issues, because that's actually what's most fun to talk about. Once the governing is done, it's most fun to talk about what color you're going to paint the church and what style of music you're going to have and what you're going to do during COVID. Those are operational issues that are actually sometimes more fun to talk about than governing. Most frustrations experienced by the board can be avoided by clear, consistent understanding and implementation of specifically the governance structure. So what is that? What is that? There are 3 things that are on the job description of a governing board. And these are the 3. First of all is where are we headed, which is related to vision and mission, your positioning statements that you're working on, clearly in the realm of everything to do with the ends or the results that the organization is meant to achieve for the beneficiaries of the organization. Where are we headed? Has to do with the ends or the purpose for which the charity was established. And these are they become the primary basis for evaluating the chief executive or the lead pastor of a church. They ask the question, what difference is this organization going to make, and what value do we add to the world? That's clearly a board conversation. But once that's done, you don't revisit that every month. That's in place. You then start to filter through, are we headed in that direction? Are we staying within the confines of our mission, vision, values? And it's just not a weekly or a monthly conversation. The second thing you hold in trust is what's important to us, which are related to your core values. What are the non-negotiables of how you're going to go about delivering your services to the people that your church benefits? These represent the major constraints on how you will or you won't do business. And Carver suggests the board's best control over the staff is to limit, not prescribe. Let me explain that a little bit. So oftentimes, organizations, without knowing the difference between working and governing, the board can become a group of people that in their advice giving, they start telling the staff what to do, telling the staff how to do their job, and prescribing activity. And that's not the role of a governing board. The governing board's best control over their organization isn't to tell the staff what to do. It's to say, here's the few things that you're not allowed to do, and make sure you don't do them. And those are called executive limitations. So here's the few things you're not allowed to do. Lead pastor, other than that, it's up to you on how to play this game in order to go about moving us towards our vision, mission, and values. And that's incredibly liberating for your staff to be able to be proscribed, have limits to their activity, not prescriptions to their activity.
Can you give us examples, Dave, of what you mean?
Yeah, sure. So I will I have all of these templates for you. I have all of the samples for you that you're going to get in order to implement this later. So I'm going to give you a whole 4 pages of types of executive limitations for you to adopt or not adopt and customize. But things like, trying to think of what's on ours. Like I can't let our operational balance fall below this amount. I can't function outside of an HR strategy. I can't let anything negatively impact the public image of the organization. I can't not meet the commitments that the organization is making to third parties. It's a whole bunch of can'ts, and it sounds horrible because the staff right away go, "Oh, you're going to tell me what that just sounds so heavy-handed, and you're going to tell me what I can't do." But once you've got the few things that you can't do, it's incredibly liberating to know, other than that, you can play this game however you want as the coach to get the players to play in order to win. And so this is how a governing board controls the staff. That control sounds really horrible maybe, but this is the best way to control the staff. Here's the few things that you're not allowed to do. Other than that, move us towards the vision mission within the constraints of our values.
Perhaps a different way of looking at it might be and philosophically, we might agree with this. When we know what we're saying no to,
sure,
we're able to say yes to those things that we're called to do.
Yeah,
I think if I were to apply it to Cedar Valley, an example might be we would hold to, from our confession of faith, an executive limit for a pastor on staff at Cedar Valley currently. My understanding of the culture would be that we would hold to the confession of faith and we would only marry men to women and women to men at this point. That to me would be an executive limitation.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, that's a great example. Typically, executive limitations and policies are built around worry areas. If you're worried about something and you're wanting to be sure how you're going to handle it when it comes up, you either put a policy in place or an executive limitation in place to limit the actions of the staff or the lead pastor, and through that person, the staff. So that's a great example.
Which, by the way, as a staff member, is liberating to know your lane, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not. We're not. I'm not speaking for Grant or Doug, but I wouldn't be offended by that limitation. I would find it helpful.
Yeah. So rather than the senior pastor saying, "Oh, this issue comes up, moral issue comes up. How are we going to handle that?" Or just an operational issue comes up. How are we going to handle that? The senior pastors are thinking, okay, I guess I got to go ask the board for permission, or I got to go ask the board to do this or to do that. That's the typical stuff of working boards. Whereas the chief executive or the lead pastor in the situation, when an issue comes up, would say, am I functioning within my limitations? Yep. Well, then it's up to you to decide on how to do that, which includes budgetary items. Here's the budget that's put in place for the organization. You functioning within the executive limitations regarding finances and budget? Yeah. Well, then do it. It's up to you to make happen.
Dave, I noticed that we're halfway through,
Yeah.
And I would wonder if anyone needs a break and if this would be an appropriate time for a break.
Yeah, I was going to suggest a break halfway through, so this is a perfect time, and we can finish this after.
Okay. How long do you guys want to take, Dave, or how long do you want us to take?
You make a decision, Rob. 5 or 10 minutes.
I'll say 5.
Okay.
Because I don't know what the content to come yet is. I was trying to leave it to you, but let's say 5 minutes. It is currently 10:33. Let's meet back here at 10:40. We'll compromise.
That's great.
Okay. Is that cool, everybody? Okay. Thank you.
If you can hear, come on back. We'll get started.
There's some good stuff in the chat bar there, Dave,
Yeah.
that you may or may not want to look at. I like Teresa's observation there. Particularly agree, Leslie, who's the boss? If I have an issue at work, I go to my boss, but at church, who is the boss besides God? Well done, Teresa. What is the workflow? Similar to a reporting structure. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll say
the discussion, sorry, the discussion is not included in the slides, but the recording of the Zoom itself will retain the chat bar.
Should we get started?
Yep.
Everyone back? Okay. So first thing, where are we headed? Second thing, what's important to us relates to core values, limitations, the constraints, and how you're going to do what you're doing. The third thing that is the governing board is responsible for, and there are only three, is are we healthy? Are we effective? Are we doing the things that we're there to do for the people that we exist for as an organization? Are we healthy, and how do we know it? This relates to the board's monitoring of the lead pastor's performance to meet certain ends within certain limitations. So once you've got this structure in place and you've got your ends and your vision, mission, values, and strategy, they become the means by which you evaluate your lead pastor rather than some sort of vague concept of how he or she is performing. And so the question is this person moving us towards our vision, mission, values, and strategy? And are they functioning within the limitations that we've given them? This monitoring is obtained through appropriate information reported by the lead pastor to the boards or the board's independent assessments if they can't trust or need more information than what that lead pastor is asking for. So this is typically dashboard reporting is the word that you might be hearing in other organizations, and you might even use it. But here's what happens. Board meeting comes up, lead pastor's trying to come up with his or her report for the meeting. They write down everything that they've been doing since the last meeting to sort of justify the reason for their salary, and that goes into the board report. And you don't need that in a governing model. All you need is the key pieces of information to determine whether the organization's healthy, similar to the dashboard on a car. That should be the only information that the board needs in order to know whether the organization's healthy, not what's everything that's been going on in the organization. And again, in your case, times 3 or 4. So those are the three things. If you were to move towards a governing model of board governance, and you can tell if this is truly what your job description is as a board, you don't need a meeting every month to necessarily do this. Maybe at the beginning when you're adopting it and bringing these things, the tools in place to function in this model, and I'll show you them later. But this stuff can be done in a church scenario, maybe only 6 times a year, rather than however often boards often meet. Just going to admit Glenn into the room. So what does this look like on a job description? Where are we headed? And I've got a board mandate for you in the tools and templates. If you were to recruit board members and board members said, what does it mean to be on the board of my church? This is what you would give them. To determine the vision, mission, values, and major strategies, and to determine who the beneficiaries of the organization are. To select a lead pastor. To recruit and orient new board members. Those are the things under where we headed. What's important to us, job description items, to ensure the well-being of the organization, to ensure accountability for legal and ethical integrity, to approve and monitor major programs and services through the dashboard and board reporting, and to ensure adequate resources, personnel, facilities, and finances to make sure there's enough fuel in the tank to fund the organization, to enhance the organization's public standing by the people who are on the board. And thirdly, in the area of are we healthy and effective, to assess the achievement of outcomes, which are the ends or related to strategic plan, to ensure the organization has effective planning, because once you determine your vision, you're then going to hopefully have a strategic plan, however so often, to know whether or not you're moving towards the steps of moving towards your vision. To provide financial oversight to the organization is the primary responsibility of the board. to support and encourage the lead pastor and to assess their performance, and to evaluate your own performance as a board to keep yourselves accountable to functioning within the model and on things that are just related to ends and not means. So for example, someone brings up an issue, if you were functioning in this model, somebody brings up the issue on what are you know, I'm trying to think of something. What are we doing to recruit new Sunday school teachers in our church? One way to assess the board's own effectiveness is for somebody in the meeting to say, hey, wait a minute, that's a means issue. That's not an ends issue. That's not what we should be talking about in a board meeting. If they don't relate to these 3 items, then it shouldn't be on the agenda in a board meeting. And again, we have a template for assessing the performance of the senior pastor and one for assessing the board's own effectiveness to make sure it's functioning within this model. What information does the board need? So if assuming this is the case, what information, assuming you were a governing board, what information do you think that the board needs? Someone want to maybe comment on what you think that might be in the chat, or else unmute yourself and speak it.
The purpose of the organization.
Yep, for sure it needs that. Yep, that's related to number 1. So your key positioning statements, which you're working on right now. So that's excellent.
You're looking for more specific metrics, Dave?
Yeah. Like, what are some of the things that would, in your context, would help you know if you are healthy as an organization right now? Those are the kinds of things that you're going to call for in a report from the lead pastor, a dashboard report. What do you think those might be? What do you think some of those things might be? How do you know if the car is healthy?
I think that that's one of the key things that we're working on, is the fact that we don't actually have the clear understanding of what would be communicated as us succeeding in our outcomes, or what we would consider to be healthy, because there are so many, like has been mentioned multiple times already, there are so many good intentions and good programs, but the collective vision and mission is kind of ambiguous at this point. And so for us to be able to gauge whether or not we're meeting that is very difficult.
Okay. So it might be a premature conversation or a premature question on my part. So why don't we just move on? Some of those things typically are dashboard indicators around the quantitative and qualitative measurements you're going to use to determine whether you're healthy. What's our bank balance like? How much money came in the last month through church offerings? How many people are attending church? How many people are in Sunday school? Not how are we going to find Sunday school teachers, but numbers and like quantitative and qualitative measurements to determine whether or not you're healthy. And that's the information you call for as a board, and that becomes the lead pastor's board report every month. And again, I have templates for you for that as well, so we won't park there for very long. Because a board can't simply keep up with all the information in a growing organization. If your lead pastor doesn't know what information to bring to the board, the default is to try and bring as much as possible because they feel like they need to, and the board ends up with way more information around means than around ends, and it's just not needed. The board needs to identify the information that it needs in each of those 3 areas of trusteeship. And I think it was Kate that said one of them is where are we headed as an organization. That's one piece of information. Again, you're not going to make that up every board meeting, but that's one piece of information in the first area of trusteeship. And then you call for reports that provide that information. And I won't leave you to guess what those are. We'll give you some ideas on what that could mean. But once you've instituted this model, there'll be this kind of coaching conversations around what do we need from the lead pastor in our board to know whether or not we're healthy. In general, the board's questions focus on what? The evidence of whether or not the organization is achieving what it's there to achieve, not the how information, but the what information, evidence, results, what's going on in the organization, not how is it going about the organization. So What I'm going to here's some stuff that's hands-on and hands-off for a governing board. If you were to make a decision, I've just picked some things here to try and separate them to say, here's the stuff that we should be talking about in a board meeting. Here's the stuff we shouldn't be. So hands-on, set the board's work plan and agenda for the year and each meeting. Determine the board training and development, like what you're doing today. Attend to discipline in board attendance following bylaws and governance manual to make sure you're functioning within the government bylaws that we have to be, and then your governance manual, the internal way you're going to go about governing. Meet with and gather wisdom from the ownership, the beneficiaries of the organization. Get to know the people the organization benefits and get to know what's going to help them, not in terms of representing them in board meetings, but just getting to know the pulse and what's going on in the day-to-day of the people who the organization's benefiting. Establish limits of the pastor through executive limitations, including the budgetary plans. The budget should function as an executive limitation. Not, can I spend this today? Or can we afford this today? But it's set as executive limitation.
I got a few. It's a real flood at the back.
Where? How far out?
To the big tree.
So, okay. So, okay, keep going. Sorry, did somebody have a question around budget, or should I just keep going?
Rob, if you're trying to talk, you're muted.
Thanks, Grant. I wasn't sure who was trying to ask the question, David. I'm trying to figure that out. It might have been Jean or Glenn. So I not seeing them. I'll let you. Yeah, just go.
Keep going. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Establish results, recipients, and establish the costs of those results that justify the organization's existence. Again, that happens in the strategic planning and the budgeting process. Examining monitoring data to determine whether the organization's achieved reasonable results. These are similar to what some of the things that we talked about. This would be hands-on for the board. What's hands-off? Establish the services, programs, curriculum, or budgets. Approve a pastor's personnel or spending that happens within the budget is hands-off. Unless one of your key dashboard indicators is, wow, we're really not doing well in terms of funding right now. We need to put into place another limit around budget items because we're bringing in way less money than we should. But assuming the organization's in fine financial health, the pastor shouldn't have to come back to the board asking for spending within a budget that they've already determined to be the budget. Hands-off is rendering judgments or assessments of staff activity. If you're going to function within a governance model, the board has one staff member, and that's the lead pastor, and the other staff members report to the pastor. And so commenting on or evaluating the staff activity, their performance is hands-off. Determining development of the organization, the people, the needs, terminations, promotions, designing staff jobs or instructing staff who are subordinate to the lead pastor would be hands-off. Deciding on organizational chart staffing requirements would be hands-off, because that all has to do with means or operational activity. Or establishing a committee to help advise the staff or help the staff unless the staff want that. So committees should be used on a very rare basis. If they're a board committee, it's to help the board do its job. If there's a committee of the day-to-day of the operating of the organization, you might be a board member who's sitting on a committee, fundraising committee. When you're in that fundraising committee, you become essentially, you report to the lead pastor. If you're sitting on a means activity subcommittee, you're not functioning in that capacity as a board member. You report ultimately through the chief executive or the lead pastor. So that's some hands-off and hands-on. Is there any other things you think would be good to add to this in your context to make this real for your church, Rob, or anybody else? There's obviously more, but this is just a sample.
Well, as I look at those, and those are helpful actually, it makes me think it's called a board meeting because those sound boring, but they're not.
No.
And I would say, having sat on your board, Dave, for 3 years, one thing that you might be missing here, guys, is warmth of story and connection. And we're not saying that this board can't function that way, that there isn't space for stories about the means, stories about what we've done. That might even be how we would start those meetings.
Yeah.
Just to keep us connected. If we went for this model, right? We're not presuming, David's language has been clear that way. We're not presuming that this should be the model for Cedar Valley. We're just giving you a sense of what it could be. So do you guys
Great
have
point.
any questions or thoughts otherwise? Yeah,
Yeah,
Justin?
if so, in your opinion, Rob, like if we adopted a more executive role for a lead pastor, does that give someone like you too many obligations, so that you like, would you be able to fulfill all the obligations as an executive administrator of our church, but also a spiritual leader? Like I feel like the role becomes humongous when you kind of remove yourself as a board, when you remove yourself from like that supporting, more hands-on role. Just a
So a couple of observations. I think with good executive limitations in place that would be designed by this board, I think a lead leader would welcome the ability to lead its staff. And we're assuming, I think, Dave, that the last word, the authoritative word, comes from the congregation, meaning this, that if the Carver model is staff sort of led with partnering lay leadership that is overseen by the lead leader, that encircling all of that is the congregation to say, ultimately, we can remove you, lead pastor, if we need to, but day to day, no. I would welcome a structure like this if it were me. I would, because we get into muddy conversations. Like, I'll give you an example, Justin. You guys asked me to oversee staff, and that's great, and it's how I was able to serve you for a time in this function. But I have that responsibility, but no authority.
Oh, yeah.
So this model, and it sounds like, and I'm imagining it sounds to many of you like you would just be giving all the authority over to a lead pastor and the staff. That would be a misread, actually, but it would give, I think, more space for the called, experienced, educated leaders of your church, the liberty to function with the day-to-day realities. Does that help you? Does it help you, Justin? And everybody else for that matter?
Yeah, it does. It's just I guess we're just so unused to operating within that model, and so it'd be interesting to see how, like, I would be interested to see, as like me being a board member and then operating on the worship committee and answering to, like, removing myself from that position. Now I'm on the worship committee answering to Grant, who reports to you. Like, ultimately that would the ultimate design would be, right? So I do love that model.
I think the way you just expressed that actually is a really good application of understanding.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. That's clear. I really like what Rob said about the hands-on stuff here could seem a little bit boring and disconnected. And it is the lead pastor or the chief executive's job to keep the board connected to the heartbeat of why the organization's there. And that stuff that's all related to, are we healthy and are we accomplishing our vision, mission, values? So in our board meetings, as Rob referred to at the very beginning of the meeting, we show a video of something happening in the field. We zoom in our field partners to board meetings to talk about what's going on in their organizations around the world. We have something called sampling the product, where we bring staff in and the staff talk about what they're doing day to day in the organization, not from a reporting perspective, but for keeping them connected to the heartbeat of why the organization's there. Board and lead pastor relationship. Justin's asking some fantastic questions that are usually one ahead of the screen that we're coming to. It's perfect. Because
That's because he's just so clever.
He is.
Just is.
Yeah, because you're understanding, it's clear you're understanding the implications of moving towards this model, and that's awesome. So as we said, the board has one employee, the lead pastor. The board chair and the lead pastor are parallel leaders in the organization. The chair leads the board, and the lead pastor leads the staff, but parallel leaders that work on board agendas together. The board is responsible to hire and care for the lead pastor through whom the work of the organization is done. So we saw a great comment about there would need to be accountability in the structure, and there absolutely would be. And if you adopted the Carver model, you would have the tools in place to have that accountability there. It's designed exactly for the accountability. Some of the things that I do in our board, again, is to help ensure that I'm not seen as controlling information or not telling the board everything they need to know. I do have one or two board staff members that come to board meetings that are there as a resource to the board. They're not board members. They don't have decision-making authority. They're there for more information. They're there as just even a symbol of the fact that I'm not trying to control all the information, and I'm still being kept accountable for what the organization's there for. So board members are free to talk with and share views with the staff members, for sure. However, the lead pastor directs the work of the staff. If a staff member feels directed in their job by a board member, that crosses over into the lead pastor's responsibility and out of governance and into working board again. Also important to know, the board only has life when it's together in formally called meetings. You know those, well, you know, I met on Sunday in the foyer with a board member, and they said, or we went out for a meeting for lunch and with one of the board members, and they said this, you know, those meetings that happen outside of meetings where individual board members speak outside of a board meeting with their board member hat on, crosses over from governance into working as well. So the board only ever has life when it's together in formally called meetings. And no one speaks for the board unless the board has spoken through formal decisions. So again, you don't get that, well, so-and-so's on the board and they said this, so therefore it must carry weight. The only time the board speaks is through decisions made by the board through their formal decision-making process. The board speaks with one voice through its decisions. So even though you may not have voted for a specific decision, or that when it's decided and it's approved, the board comes together then and says it's a board decision, and therefore I'll support it, even though I may not have voted for it. But that's the one voice that the board speaks with, regardless of how you may have voted in a board meeting. Board minutes. This is a little tactical, but board minutes have the potential in this model to only be a record of decisions, not a record of discussions. If you've got a board secretary taking minutes and they're trying to feverishly capture conversations, it's not only not necessary, it's unhelpful, because you're getting another person's perspective of what was the most important thing said in that meeting, and therefore it will taint your minutes. So we try and keep a really strict control on the fact that the only thing that's in our board minutes are one page, and it's just a record of decisions that were made and not a record of conversation.
How does that sound to you, Teresa? Does that sort of resonate with your heart? I saw you smiling there, and I thought maybe that was working for you.
I have 6 pages of today's meeting so far.
That's okay. Today's not a board meeting. You're capturing training and development, so that's okay. Grant had a good question here. We do a fair bit of dialogue and decision making through board only email chains? Is this practice that should stop and keep it to meeting only? That's a good question. I think if it's a matter of making decisions, it's possible to meet between meetings to make decisions virtually, and then those minutes or those conversations, or sorry, those decisions are recorded through minutes. But it depends on sort of the essence of those board emails. If you're carrying on a meeting outside of the meeting, then it's not healthy. If that's the purpose of your emails, is to carry on a meeting outside of a meeting, generally not a good idea.
Would you say, Dave, that email conversations aren't the place for conversation, but they might be for a decision?
Yeah, that's, I think, just general good understanding of limits of email, and anything that's sensitive or you're actually having conversation where you're trying to read body. Good communication rarely happens through email ever. So especially if it's a sensitive thing. So emails for things like
sometimes
Mhm.
just even for decision making, like most often it's necessary for there to be a vote, right? And so that
Right.
doesn't really happen in a functional email.
No, there are ways to technically get email votes on conversations, and that can happen. So I've put out a motion through email to our whole board, and all the board members respond with yay or nay to that email, yes or no. And then we actually record, we do keep those emails as minutes, because it's a virtual meeting. So they can happen, but it's not for discussion. It's, for example, we need to appoint an auditor. This is the auditor that we think. So the motion is to approve so-and-so as an auditor. If anybody wants to discuss it outside of an email, then we'll call a meeting. But I think we probably had email votes 5 or 6 times in 18 years. So it's not very often at all. But if your board's not meeting very often because it's functioning within a governance model, sometimes it can get away with those kinds of decisions happening that way. No individual has authority to speak for the board unless given by the board. So again, in your governance manual, you should have, if you don't, you should have a policy on who speaks for the board outside of board meetings, almost like a board spokesperson if the media shows up or that kind of thing. But it's appointed by the board for specific reasons. If an individual agrees with a decision by the whole within a governance structure, we've talked about this already, it's supported. Even if you voted against it, it's supported. And when you leave the meeting, you speak as if you did vote for that thing if you're on the board, because of the concept of the board speaking as a whole, or it doesn't speak at all. Chairperson's role: to keep the board performing its function and not the staff's function. Basically functioning within this model, knowing when conversations do cross over into means and leave the realm of ends. The chair, while the chair guides the meeting within the agreed upon rules and roles, everyone is responsible for healthy meetings. It is important for every board member to know what their role is and isn't, because difficult board members are less the problem than others who let them continue to behave that way. And so one story we have as an organization in our early days is we had a board member come on, and they were constantly trying to get us to do our international programs in a certain way in a certain country. And they viewed their role on the board as a way to leverage to get us to be doing certain things in a certain country. And because we had this board training that I'm giving you right at our beginning, the board chair took this person out and said, when you're in the meeting, you're thinking and making decisions in what's the best interest of the organization, not in some part of the organization or what it's doing. Your role is to be making decisions and having conversation on what's in the best interest of the whole, not a part. So if you can't do that, you need to step off the board. And the guy decided to step off the board because he realized that he didn't have the personal discipline to not try and get us to be doing X in this part of the organization. That's the chairperson's role. Very freeing for a lead pastor or an executive director who doesn't have to police that or monitor that. The agenda, as you can imagine.
Sorry, but again, only possible if the roles are clear, right?
Yep, exactly. Oh yeah, for sure. Because then I would have thought, if this wasn't clear as the executive director, I would have thought, well, that person's a board member. I really should listen to what they say and do X in Y country. Ensuring the agenda works for the board's job. And obviously this has implications for what's in the board meeting. So structuring an agenda around decisions that focus only on areas of trusteeship, those three main areas and what's in that job description. Structure the agenda to deal with the most critical things first. For example, decision items at the beginning, discussion items next, and then general information last, because you can always communicate general information outside of a board meeting if you don't have time. So not just putting a whole bunch of general things on an agenda because we think that's what the board should be talking about, but this governance structure gives you a filter for determining what should be on the agenda and where it should be on the agenda in order to function within the model. Have decision recommendations presented in a way that the core issues and alternatives can be easily assimilated for the decision making. So I'll give you something called a one-page decision profile. Well, I'll give you all these tools, but one of the things, if there's a new item for business at the board meeting, I'll prepare a decision or a discussion profile for the board ahead of time that says the decision we're looking for, alternatives that have been considered, background, context, research, so that when the board members get the board pack, we send out the board pack a week before the meeting. They all read what's in the board pack and they come ready to make decisions, not come trying to get caught up to speed on everything in the meeting itself. It keeps our meetings short and focused on the things that they should be focused on. We have a template for the agenda and a board pack to show you what that looks like. So this is a lot of detail. We're nearing the end of our time, so I want to come back out to the 30,000 foot view and show you what this looks like from a structural perspective. So a board lead pastor and staff relationship. You've got the board focused on results. Where are we headed? What's important? Are we healthy? Legal trust and avoiding unacceptable risks through executive limitations. That's the board's job, focus on ends or the results. You got the staff who focus on operations or means, plan and implement strategies that will move towards the vision within the confines of policies and executive limitations, operational day-to-day activity, staffing, finance, program, systems, activities, basically everything that's operational. And the connection between the two is a lead pastor. And in a congregational governance model, you've got the congregation that surrounds all of it that I believe likely elect who the board members are. I'm not totally sure on what that means for you, but in a congregational governance model, it's important to see that context as well. In a sports analogy, if another analogy is helpful, you've got the management of the organization, the board, they determine what the win is, the overall direction of the team, the rules that they must play within. You've got the coach who's parallels the lead pastor, and the staff or the team, the volunteers and staff. So in a church, it's everybody volunteering is a part of that team, and they play the game and work towards the win. You might have some board members who are functioning in a board model, and when they come to volunteer at the church, they put on their team member hat, and then they play the game with every other team member, but they're doing that as a team member, not as a board member. So you might feel like you're drinking from a fire hose, especially given the complexity of your situation. But Rob, maybe we could facilitate. What are some of the ways the board can transition to this if you need to? What are some of the issues that need to be addressed in the transition? How would you like to move forward from this presentation to now talking about where this may or may not land in your situation? Maybe we should start with questions or big picture questions that we might not have covered in the presentation.
Yeah, I would welcome that, guys. If you have any questions or observations, or we started with feelings and thoughts, we'll take those too if you have them.
I think this has the potential to be really great. I'm excited about this. I was a part of this. I was a part of a church that had this model, and it was very freeing. It was very, it was really exciting. People knew their roles. I'm hesitant to get really excited about it just because I don't know that people will be as excited because it's just such a big change of governance. So I think it's great. I think it has the potential to be really healthy and really positive. In terms of actually like implementing that, I have no idea.
Yeah, I agree with Leslie. I think that the conversations that I've had with Rob and with Dan in the past around just feeling like they both had great ideas and wanted to do things, but they felt completely just unable to do them because of the way that our structure is set up and our congregational model that I think we take it way too far as how involved the congregation needs to be made in all sorts of decisions that a lot of times are just ridiculous having everyone involved in like, okay, are we going to buy chairs? Like, seems like kind of a silly thing. But nonetheless, I think we have a great opportunity if we move to this model to really make some headway and develop some areas of accountability and see our church grow and thrive. So I hope we get there.
I think, guys, the main challenge is exactly what Leslie and Terry have said here. I think the optics will be, if we go towards this, and this is what we'll have to pray about and can discern as a transition team, that we are removing the congregation's ability to input and to provide, I don't want to say control, but it might be that. The challenge, I think the challenge then is to help them see that a model like this might actually reduce the load on them, reduce the anxiety that it creates, reduce the tension that exists, and to understand that, again, the congregation always functions as the final authority in this model. It might not be the first authority because you are unleashing your educated, experienced, called to leaders to do the work of the day with you as a congregation. So it's why this conversation is so critical. It's why we got to be praying our brains out. It's why even on the screen, you'll have to ask yourself, what does this mean for me in the church I love? What will it require of me in terms of learning and maybe sacrificing, maybe changing my mind about certain things?
There is definitely a huge role for the congregation, even if you do adopt this model, because in the strategic planning process, in the choosing of the strategic planning process, the envisioning process, there's lots of need to get stakeholder feedback from everyone in the church on decisions that will be made by decisions made by the board, or even some means decisions made by the staff. And so in the strategic planning process, that's the perfect place to involve the board or the congregation, so that they feel like they have a voice in what the church is planning and doing without feeling like they are entitled to a say in every decision made. So they might see this model and say, oh, we're being cut out and now we don't have a place in this. That's not the case. They should be involved at key times and key decisions or key planning times.
Yeah, and I would go as far as saying, guys, that this board cannot function without those three things being in place that they have to oversee, which includes the strategic plan and vision and mission and values, right? So thanks, David, for saying that.
Can I ask a question? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Thanks, Dan.
Okay. So like our elders, leadership team, executive, finance would still continue to function, correct?
Tell me more about your question.
They would still continue to function in what they're doing, but they would be supplying that information to the board, who then would make the decisions as to which direction, what to do with that information.
If they're not board members, I mean, you could still have a finance committee. You could have the committees that you want on a day-to-day basis, but they would be actually accountable to the lead pastor, who's accountable to the board in this model.
Okay.
So
Well, who
Who,
does the budget?
where does the board get its information from?
the lead pastor.
All functions through the lead pastor. That seems like a lot, but
Yep. It is a lot, but that's really essentially the role of the chief executive. So that the lead pastor would bring a budget forward. So in a governance model, the lead pastor would, based on the strategic plan of the organization, bring forward a budget, get budget input from the various parts of the organization and church, bring a budget forward at the beginning of the year to be approved by the board. So all the information that comes to the board funnels through the lead pastor in this model.
But the information on budget would come from the people.
Yeah.
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 So specifically though, would it come from a finance committee, for instance? I think maybe is what Stan's asking. Is that right, Stan?
yeah, well, I think there's value in these different committees.
What do you think the value is currently?
Well, I think the elders, I believe their prime focus should be on the spiritual well-being of the church. The executive, the legalities and etc. That function, and the finance committee, the financial health and oversight as far as regulations and making sure we can maintain our charitable status, et cetera, that the rules of the CRA are being followed. We accept that the finance committee is an advisory committee, and but I just like,
Big change. It's a big change. The reality of your various committees, though, from an outside perspective, just being direct, I think it would be very, very difficult for you to still maintain the committees as you currently have them and transition to a governance model, because I think people will still function in those committees as they've always functioned.
Who does it then?
Dave, I think it might be
Yeah.
helpful to explain how finance would operate under this new model and how these
Sure.
various functions would operate under this new model, because I think that's where there's some confusion.
Sure.
yes.
Yes.
Good stuff, Terry.
Let me go back. Sorry. Yeah, that might be helpful even in terms of this is an organizational chart, or view this from the lens of an organizational chart. You could, and any of the committees that relate to day-to-day operational activity. So staffing, finance, programs, systems, any activities that address the day-to-day, the mission of what the organization's about, is the information and the function of those committees are accountable and responsible to a lead pastor. So I'm not absolutely clear on the three committees that you have now. I don't know that, I think you've got a mix of governing and functioning in all of those 3 or 4 committees. So it's impossible from my perspective to say these 2 would be over here and these 2 would be over here, because none of them function within a strict ends and means division or distinction. But in terms of going forward, what you would do is determine anything that falls into this category would be overseen, and the information would come through the lead pastor. If there are activities that relate to any of these areas, the board absolutely can establish subcommittees to help it with the functioning of this information. For example, our organization has an audit subcommittee of the board, where once a year it meets with our auditor to go through the audit process and hear all the information from our auditor and brings that back to the board. One time we had a vision, mission, and values subcommittee of the board who did some wordsmithing and work, who would bring that back to the board. So you can establish subcommittees of the board for the board's activity, and then they're accountable ultimately really to the chair of the board and the lead pastor in their parallel roles. But it depends on, I think it's hard to answer your question really specific, Terry, to where your current 4 committees would fall, because all 4 of them have a mix of governing and working together.
Okay, so I'll try to get at it for Stan's sake. I think his question is important to try to address, and that is, with this model, what would be the function of a finance committee? Does this model remove that? Like, it does seem to me, even Dave, to have everything running through the lead pastor. Like, so we're presenting a budget to the congregation shortly. That wouldn't be my responsibility if I was the lead pastor. Where would the information, how would we collect input?
That's helpful. That's helpful. So if in the budgeting process, I think it might make sense for a church, or sounds like it would for you, if the lead pastor knows the budget process is coming up, I want to pull together, as the lead pastor, I should pull together these people that know what's going on with finances in our church, what we're spending on what the plans are, what we're going to need to upkeep the building, because we've got a building subcommittee or a building a facilities committee, and they know what the building's going to cost to maintain. Yeah, absolutely. A finance committee would absolutely be beneficial in providing that information from the lead pastor in order to present a budget. Does that answer that question specifically, Stan?
Yeah, kind of. I'm not speaking against this model. I support it.
It's okay.
I'm just wondering, like, that the board needs to get their information so that they can govern from somewhere, right?
Right.
Like, does the finance committee submit a report to the pastor, who then passes that on to the board?
Yeah, that could be the case if the lead pastor is bringing a budget that has input.
Well, even just on the monthly or bi-monthly, whatever the health of our finances, the board needs to know that. Is the church healthy financially? Right.
Yeah, and that information would come from the senior pastor would call for that information from the whoever manages the books and the day-to-day financial, and then bring that to the board as part of the lead pastor's report to the board every month.
If I can speak to that too, like in our general operations right now, or at least in recent past, has been that like there is essentially a liaison from the finance team to the executive, and there's reporting on details. But what I'm understanding from this workshop is that more like if things are functioning in a healthy structure and there aren't areas that need consideration or change, that essentially that point on the agenda for the board of directors discussion would be that in finances, all things are taking place as needed to accomplish our means. And that wouldn't have to go any further. Is that correct?
Depending on the information that the board's calling for financially to determine whether the organization's healthy financially, the short answer is yes.
So just a question for clarification, Dave, would it be fair to say that the lead pastor in this model would be the one sole person that sort of carries the chain of communication through the different functioning bodies?
Yes, lead pastors getting that information from lots of different places within the organization, but the information that the board gets is through the lead is through and by the lead pastor or the chief executive of the. Yeah.
Thank you.
Which is why there's a huge amount of trust that needs to be there in this lead pastor. But what the lead pastor can do, similar to what we do in our organization, is when it comes time to me to present my report at the board meeting, I have other staff there so that every once in a while, a board member will ask me a question and I'll include the other staff to help provide information in that board meeting so that I'm making a very clear, symbolic, real show that I'm not trying to control all the information in an unhealthy sense.
I think that's super key.
Yeah.
That's accountability and transparency. I like that a lot.
Yeah, I guess just as a comment and an observation, just with regard to this model and the function of a lead pastor and the fact that we're kind of in transition as far as searching for that candidate. This lead pastor, we have to think about the skill set for him as being almost a function of a chief executive officer, more, as well as shepherd of the flock, so to speak, right?
Yeah, Ruben, that's a really astute observation here. And one of the realities of governance and in terms of expectations in churches is pastors now are expected to be an incredible orator, a chief executive, an incredible shepherd and caregiver, a counselor, and all of those things. So absolutely there needs to be this, but yet some churches choose to have a senior pastor who's going to look after the spiritual oversight, and then they're going to maybe have an executive pastor that helps the senior pastor with areas of day-to-day operating and information. And so there are ways to structure staff roles like you've got in the various roles that are needed. But yeah, good observation, and good to know when you're searching for a senior pastor based on your governance model what's going to be needed by that person.
I noticed, guys, it is 11:30, and we would want to give you permission to leave without prejudice if you need to. But if you're willing, we can maybe handle one or two more questions,
Yeah,
Dave.
sure, absolutely, as long
or
as you
comments, because it's more important to me anyway that you feel like you've been heard and you've been given a chance to ask the questions and you get clarity. And just to manage expectations, we're obviously not making a decision today about switching to a certain model. We're just having a conversation around what might be the most effective way for Cedar Valley to move forward, okay? And this will be, again, this is a conversation being hosted today by your transition team, and it's a topic that we'll work through with you as a congregation.
It's been helpful. I appreciate the information.
Thanks, Stan.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a lovely shot of your ceiling, by the way, Stan.
Good.
Yeah.
Not
Did you want to
necessarily
give
a
it?
Like the view?
Love it. Go ahead, Grant.
Yeah, it wasn't necessarily just a question. I just had a thought, a comment, because I know a lot of people at Cedar Valley have grown up at Cedar Valley as their one main church. I've been part of a number of churches. This model might sound really foreign or different, but it's not actually very foreign. It's adopted by a lot of church organizations. So it's not this out there new agey thing. It is tried and true as well. So I'll just throw that out towards Fulwell and Dave.
And it's something that the 4 C's, if you were to go to the 4 C's for governance help, is what they'd say, to use this as your kind of backbone. And it doesn't mean that a church needs to forget its spiritual leadership or eldership and now become board members, because there's all kinds of ways to use this structure to govern, but still have, for example, an elders team that does visitation, or deacons that work on the church building and helping with the budgeting and the tracking of finances. There's all kinds of ways that ecclesiastical roles will fit into this, but it does clarify them so that they can function in the way they were intended.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that for a number of years, I had opportunity to be a part of the MEI board, and they followed this model of governance here. And it was very clear what our role was and what it wasn't. Very effective. And I can see Cedar Valley moving towards this would be really key to our health, but it's how we move through this and present it is probably the biggest thing for the overall concept of Cedar Valley.
Yeah, good point. If you determine that you wanted to move towards this, there would be a lot of need to pay attention to really good change management in that process. Care for people's concerns.
It seems that because Cedar Valley is such a historical church, like there's a lot of history for family connectedness, there's a lot of sense of responsibility and ownership from families that have been invested in Cedar Valley for such a long time. And so it seems, this is just an observation and maybe perhaps a question too, but like engaging every person in the church in a sense of responsibility seems to be very key in helping people feel as though they are involved and feeling positively about moving forward in a new structure. So, and my question and my thought really is like, instead of it being so focused on the operations of the church, how can we invest in the identity of each person that's a part of Cedar Valley to feel excited about being more outwardly focused instead of just on like ministry and building of the church. And that's something that I feel that has been communicated really well, and it's been a huge part of this transition and has been a focus of conversation with staff is how can we get our congregation excited about not just our building and the functions of our ministry, but really feeling engaged in moving forward in a vision, right? And once that happens, once people feel strongly about that vision and moving forward, I think then they can feel relaxed about allowing a new platform to come into play.
That's really wise.
And that's why the conversations have been sequenced the way they've been sequenced. Because I would agree. Vision, if we can excite our people about a common vision, a vision that would bring us together, then we can then talk about a governance structure that will unleash us to do it that makes the most sense.
Yeah, because if you were to talk about governance first, people could get the idea of, I guess I'm not needed in the life of the church. Whereas if you're talking about vision, mission, values, and strategy, everyone is needed in that. And that's without a question the first part of the conversation. As Rob said, it was why we sequenced it the way he did. What's on the screen there? If you think of some more questions, go ahead. But here's a bunch of tools that we'll give to Pastor Rob to give to you. That's a part of this. We'll give you the whole PowerPoint. There's a nonprofit board mandate. That's the job description that we showed you. The governance manual template, which is about a 25-page document to talk about the implementation of this. Simplified meeting rule of order, because that's important for board meetings, a board agenda, samples of the profiles, an example of a board pack to show what the board should get ahead of a meeting for reading. Dashboard indicators, that's the idea of the information requested by the board to see if it's healthy. That is essentially is between the dashboard indicators and the executive limitations, that does form the lead pastor's report. Executive Director's 360 assessment that we use online, that is a part of this as well as a board development assessment that we're also put online that will help the board to know whether it's functioning within this model. And then a whole list of policy development checklists, not because you need to fill up your policy book, but because they just help you to think about some potential worry areas that a policy might help you to deal with. So this is all part of what you'll receive after this.
And just to give you a sense of process moving forward, I think all of the transition team is present to this, if I'm not mistaken. We will not start processing this conversation immediately because we have not finished processing the vision conversation. So you might think our meeting on Thursday is going to trend towards this conversation. It won't, or we'll try to keep focused on mission and vision and values. And I imagine we'll get to this conversation later in February or early March, and then have some things for our congregation to consider in April at this point. If there aren't any other questions or observations, again, guys, thanks for giving your Saturday morning. Like, you guys are rock stars. Really appreciate your time and your questions and your genuineness and your hope for better. And we'll figure this out together. If there aren't any more questions or comments, then I might ask Doug if you wouldn't mind closing our time in prayer. Dave, is that okay with you? Okay. No questions I see. So Doug, would you mind doing that?
I would be honored. God, we do thank you for this opportunity to gather together as your church, considering how each of us who have been called by your name can be a part of this glorious gathering that brings honor to you, and God brings your great love into our community and those around us, and builds us up as we encourage and teach and train, but also as we reach out in love. God, may we be sensitive to the changes that we are moving through. God, and may we be able to walk side by side with those giving understanding and wisdom and insight. And God, may we even seek that for ourselves, greater clarity on what we have been called to do and how to work together in the best way to bring glory to your church. Thank you for Dave and what he's brought to us, and continue what he will, and for the ministry that Rob has in transition. continue with us this day, this weekend, as we seek to serve you and live for you, for your glory and honor. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Doug. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you online tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.